So today we have two of the people involved in the Graphite project. How about you introduce yourself and just explain what the project is?
Yeah, so now that we do have our audio set up and our visuals set up after the hour of setup that you were witnessing for us, so Graphite. I'm the project founder. My name is Kevin, and basically we're building what I would like to be the graphics editor for 2D graphics that we can all, as an open source community, be proud of. And really parade as not just being an option, like a backup option, but more of the best option that can possibly exist in the entire industry. That has been my goal for quite a long time. And since I started building it 4.5 years ago and getting this community together, it has really taken off, I would say, in terms of its actual technical engineering. And we continue to make progress towards being more and more of an actual application that people can regularly use and be happy about using. Because our goal really is to make something that has no compromises in terms of really anything, in terms of usability, in terms of its actual feature set, in terms of not only beating the open source competition, but also the commercial competition in time. And really the goal here is to build what can be kind of described as the superset or the generalization of all 2D graphics software that you can ever conceive of by building something that is unified in its grand vision. It's sort of talking about like the grand, the grand unified theory of physics or something where you have one theoretical model to put everything else inside of. We're building what is essentially, you could consider it like in the same way that a game engine allows you to build any game, we're building a graphics engine that allows you to then contain any 2D graphics workflow. So as the tools can allow you to draw vector graphics or raster graphics or page layout or animation or motion graphics, or material design, or really anything like that, or of course photo editing, image manipulation. It's like one engine with tools that are, artist-friendly, designer-friendly tools that manipulate the engine for you and essentially create your graphics in a way that can be described with a single unified data model. And you can mix together raster and vector and animation and combine those all into one program, while still staying within the ecosystem of what is basically one unified editor. And we've also started out, just for knowing what exists today, we've started out with building that engine, and that's a big part of what Dennis here has been very heavily involved with from a technical perspective. But we've also then had vector graphics. So you think, Inkscape or Adobe Illustrator, those programs being kind of the main focus for where we're beginning, because vector graphics is kind of the primitive from which you build up everything else. It is kind of the most fundamental form. You're describing things with curves and with lines. And from that, you can then build up and say, oh, well, if I have this sequence of lines that can describe a brush stroke, and then a brush stroke can be raster, and then you can render raster, and you can use that for masking, and you can use that for controlling how you edit images. So we're starting out with the basics, and it also allows us to continue to make the technology more and more mature with the overall engine, and then we'll be moving more towards raster next year, and many things beyond that. Of course, animation, we have that now as well, but that's going to continue to be more and more supported, so you can mix together design, image editing, that sort of thing, with, throw in some animation while you're at it. It's all pretty unified.
If anyone couldn't tell, Kevon has been the one who's been doing the videos on the updates. He's very good at talking on camera, it seems. Dennis, introduce yourself.
Continuing the introduction. I'm Dennis. I study computer science in Germany, and we're also currently recording here in Germany. And if you couldn't tell, Kevin is the one with the vision, and I'm here to make that actually possible, to make it like feasible, to tractable, to compute this. And there's a quote from a German politician. Those who have vision should see a doctor, and I'm here to actually make the visions reality.
After all, his screen name is True Doctor, so he is, of course, the true doctor.
Oh, was that the end of your intro?
Yeah. Oh, well, I thought I might keep it short. I have a peppermint tea here, and on one of my devices I use Arch, by the way, and the other one is currently in NixOS, and yeah.
Okay.
And one of the things that always annoyed me, like I used to love photo editing and was using Adobe Photoshop, but then I moved to Linux and it just wasn't as, like, it didn't bring me joy. It wasn't as nice. So I've been longing for some alternative to get back into like creating, and that is the vision and the reason why I joined the Graphite project.
I guess similarly, to add on to my background a little bit, since I glossed over that part, since probably like elementary school, back when my computer lab in elementary school, we had 4 computers off in some room, had Flash on it, and as well as some really old version of Photoshop, and going from like turning my classmates' hair purple and that kind of like basic stuff up to doing some within a few years doing some freelance design work for like some book covers, and just really teaching myself computing in general through the means of creative software. That has been sort of my upbringing and how I am a programmer and a product designer and a graphic designer nowadays, but that has been sort of my upbringing, making Flash animations. And then eventually that moved into, also little Flash games, but then that moved into some Unity development, some web development, and that's kind of just been my background. I've generally been motivated by kind of frustration with other software, seeing whatever it might have been. Like back in the day, I was learning to do app development through frustration with iTunes being a really terrible way of playing music, your local music collection. And I never ended up completing that project because I restarted it like 5 times as I learned more and more and got better ideas for the technology stack. But yeah, building basically a better music player app that has consumed a few years of my life as I kept restarting the project and improving the design. But for me, product design has always been sort of an intuition. It's always just kind of clicked for me. It's like I see a bad design. It's like it's so obvious to me in my mind about how this could be improved with things that seem like they should have been obvious design choices, but I guess they never occurred to the designers, or they had some sort of budget or time or other sorts of technical limitations, and they were not able to achieve those better approaches that seemed obvious to me. But that's basically through frustration with other software that has been my motivation to build and teach myself all of the different skills for both engineering and designing better software. That's what drives me.
Okay. So where did the project start? So you said it's been about 4.5 years, yes?
That's the time that we began developing it. I have had the ideas rolling through my head because also I forgot to mention I've been using Blender since 2.49, quite a long time ago, right around the era before the open movie project Centel came out. So yeah, quite a while for, I guess, probably many people who have joined Blender in its more mature days, but it certainly existed plenty before I started using it as well, but I was using it in like middle school to do my middle school film project. We had to do like some sort of film project, and I animated everything. But yeah, so Blender has always been a really big inspiration to me. Even back then, when certainly its quality wasn't nearly as good as it is today, now it is truly industry leading. But I always thought that, despite the difficulties of its UI, I never thought it was really that bad, simply because 3D software is inherently complicated.
Right.
Whereas 2D graphic software really doesn't have to be inherently complicated. There are many ways of simplifying it and keeping it reasonably simple. And I've then, grown up using Photoshop and grown up using Illustrator. Well, Photoshop's a better example of a better user experience. Illustrator doesn't quite manage that same bar. But Photoshop, I would always describe as being pretty intuitive. Like, there are technical things you have to learn, and you have to, you have to find a solution to a problem that you have using a certain set of operations that you have to learn over time. But once you do that, you can really do anything. And they're not inherently that complicated. They're not buried behind too much UI. So
any technical field is inherently going to be technical and complicated, but it presents the information in a way that the application doesn't get in the way. Yeah,
exactly. So the goal really is to have, an application that can stay out of your way, but also be enabling whatever you might need to get done. So that's sort of been my design philosophy. And I've always, really appreciated that Photoshop has done a really good job with that. And I have quite a lot of respect for the software because it is, in my book, quite awesome software, actually. It has limitations, and those are some of the limitations that have inspired my design process throughout the years. So we were talking about the timeline for 4.5 years ago, we started coding this, but since I started Blender, 15-ish years ago, whenever 2.49 was, since then, I've been sort of like, what if there was an equivalent to Photoshop that was also free and open source like Blender was? And, didn't think too much of it in the days, but then over time, ideas kind of percolating in my head, and figuring out what that could be. Eventually, I started realizing, okay, the main limitation with Photoshop is that even though it has support for a lot of non-destructive operations, and we'll talk a bit more about non-destructive for anyone who's not familiar with what that means, but non-destructive operations are really like, that is the pinnacle of what graphic design, any kind of creative workflow should be about, is supporting non-destructive editing as much as possible. And Photoshop goes a pretty good way towards that, but it has limitations. You, at some point, have to start making destructive operations, which means you have to bake in your decisions and you can't go back and make changes after that point. And my entire sort of philosophy was, what if it was possible to use nodes that's really popular in 3D software with shader editing and substance designer style material editing. And, I didn't know about it at the time, but Houdini is a really good example of another professional application that's frequently used for VFX in Hollywood and for game development, creating like simulations and creating, procedural town or city generation, or, many combinations of assets, creating like a process, creating a workflow, a procedure, like an algorithm to generate whatever you might think of, whether that's a building generator that can generate any building based on any floor plan. You're basically taking data as input and producing some sort of final output based upon some final asset as your output. So the idea I thought of is like, it seemed really obvious to me. Can we take the ideas from 3D, which is node-based generation that allows you to make non-destructive as the core idea of the workflow, non-destructive editing, and can we take that and put it into the 2D context? And no one's done that. I have no idea why. I mean, I guess the answer is that we're finding out here. We knew it would be hard, but we're finding out that it is even harder than we might have even thought it would be, which we thought it would be quite hard. But it is ultimately, like, the goal here is to build this non-destructive procedural graphics engine using a node-based system to encode your artwork while, and this is the really, really important part of our core design philosophy here, making it wrapped up inside of an editor that doesn't feel like, or even doesn't expose the fact that you're using nodes at all, unless you choose to opt into that complexity. And it's not a opt-in like you have to permanently flip a switch and now you're stuck with that complexity. It's you're using layers like you're used to in a regular graphics editing software. But at any moment, if you feel like it, you can go just look at the node graph, just open the button that brings you to the node graph, and you can start modifying nodes, and then you can just close it and never look at them again. And it doesn't opt you out of layers or anything. So the idea is that you're not stuck with it. If you choose to opt in, which is the case for some software, you have to like permanently say, I want to go out of the basic workflow and move into the node-based workflow. And you never get to go back at that point. The other part is that for users who want to work with a traditional editing experience, they never have to think about them. It completely, the tooling abstracts over everything that you'd actually interact with. The nodes are done in the backend, visible if you choose to open it, but otherwise never a thing you have to concern yourself with if you're a user who is not familiar with that complexity.
And we should probably at some point also address your question. So you were asking about the development timeline. So 4.5 years ago, was that when we started the...
Yeah, February of the Rust Game Dev Meetup.
Yeah.
In 2021, I believe.
So basically, the origin story is Kevin made a design mockup. And
that was like started a couple of years before, actually. So I got to reuse some college credits. Basically, I was in my last year or so of graduation and got to reuse some get some credits basically to get out of college in time, while at the same time putting time, like hundreds of hours, into doing the design mockup and moving that significantly forward to the point where it was something we could actually use as sort of a guiding light towards building the system.
Exactly. And there is the Rust Game Dev Meetup, which was just streamed on Twitch. And Kevin went on there and presented his vision for Graphite. We didn't really have much functional code ready then, but I happened to watch that live stream and got engaged with the project, joined the Discord. And yeah, since then I've never stopped, and we started laying the foundation, building the editor, and it's been going great since then.
Yeah, a huge amount of technology and a huge amount of evolution of basically how do you take shortcuts in some areas that allow you to progress in other areas, because you can't do everything at once, or it's like painting a painting. You can't paint the tiny corner of the painting and then move on to the next little corner next to that. And then eventually, after 20 years, you have a completely highly detailed painting finished. You have to, take shortcuts, draw sketches, and then start filling in whole areas of basic paint. And then eventually you can start adding more and more detail. but you can't just start with everything at once. So software development really is about where can you strategically take shortcuts. And strategy really is a really, really important part, because there are many projects that fail based upon not having the right strategy or the right leadership to get that kind of thing figured out in a way that's able to execute in a way that's simultaneously useful to users in the short term and in the medium term and in the long term, but also able to produce something that ends up having not painted itself into a corner and get stuck with permanent decisions. And one of the really, really important philosophies for me is that we don't want to ever permanently paint ourselves into the corner of being unable to make a certain decision later on. We don't, the lofty goal, and I realize it's very lofty, is that we never want to say no to a feature. And I don't mean feature creep. There's a very big difference between feature creep, which is bad, and making the ambition of having something generalized enough to be the best possible editor based on anyone's definition, anyone's reasonable definition of what could be considered the best editor. Because if it can be generalized enough in its overall vision to support every use case, because it is ultimately a programmatic engine, in the same way a game engine, again, I mentioned earlier, a game engine can be considered generalized enough to support any game engine, or at least a sufficiently powerful one. Like game makers, I think, focus more on 2D, so you probably wouldn't be able to support a 3D game. But we want to make a generalized enough engine, like for example, Unity, that supports 2D and 3D. You know, I'm not saying that Graphite is intending to support 3D in that maybe some little ways, but it's not ever intended to be like truly a competitor to like Blender, for example, because Blender does an amazing job at what it already does.
There might be some value in importing a model and then being able to rotate that, for example.
Exactly. Like there are cases where you might want to model some sort of sculpture, let's say, for example, in Blender, and then import it in and turn it into vector graphics in some way where you're having like these different like petals or flaily things that could look nice in a 2D context, but you ultimately have to design it in 3D. That's an example of where we would probably have some sort of model import or something like that. But yeah, that's down the road.
And basically, if there's one thing that Graphite does not have,
this is the quote.
If there's one thing that Graphite does not have, it is a lack of ambition.
That has been the much pinned quote that frequently comes back, because essentially, as I was saying, the vision is to support all possible visions within overall graphics editing or 2D graphics editing. But yeah, don't make any technical decisions that preclude the ability to eventually move towards that grand unified goal of everything, of supporting everything.
Right. Do you have more questions?
Yes.
Otherwise, we're just gonna keep on yapping. And
that's totally
never
fine.
go
I love the episodes where I don't have to say a single word and the guests just yap the entire time.